The ballroom went silent for one heartbeat, and in that heartbeat, Daniel Hayes felt every eye in the room turn into a blade pressed against his skin. He stood there in his oil-stained work shirt, holding out his calloused hand beneath a chandelier worth more than every home he had ever lived in, waiting to receive what he believed was a piece of garbage being handed to him as a punchline. He did not know yet that the rusted, broken-down car rolling toward him on a velvet-draped cart was about to tear his entire life apart and then rebuild it into something he never dared to imagine. He did not know that the woman smiling coldly above him, dangling a set of tarnished keys between two manicured fingers, was about to hand him $9 million disguised as an insult. If you believe in second chances, if you believe that kindness can find its way into the most broken corners of a person's life, hit that like button right now. Drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from tonight. Share this story with someone who needs a little hope today. And subscribe to Secret Storyline so you never miss a story like this one again. Now, let's go back to where it all began. 3 months before that humiliating afternoon in the Ashworth family's marble ballroom, Daniel Hayes was a 36-year-old single father living in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of Portland, raising his 8-year-old daughter Lily on the income of a part-time auto mechanic and the leftover scraps of a marriage that had ended in betrayal 2 years earlier. Daniel's days began before sunrise and ended long after Lily had fallen asleep, clutching the worn stuffed rabbit her mother had left behind when she walked out. He worked at a small garage called Pete's Auto on the corner of 5th and Lincoln, a shop that smelled of motor oil and old coffee, where he spent 10 hours a day with his hands buried in other people's engines, trying to forget that his own life felt like a car that would never start again. Daniel had once dreamed bigger. As a teenager, he had been obsessed with restoring vintage automobiles, spending every weekend in his uncle's garage learning the language of pistons and carburetors, dreaming of one day opening his own restoration shop where broken-down classics could be brought back to life. But dreams have a way of rusting too when life keeps piling weight on top of them. When his wife Rachel left, taking nothing but her clothes and leaving behind a mountain of debt and a little girl who cried herself to sleep, asking why Mommy didn't love them enough to stay, Daniel buried his dream so deep he almost forgot it had ever existed. He told himself that surviving was enough. He told himself that as long as Lily had food on the table and a roof over her head, nothing else mattered. But surviving was getting harder every single month. The garage where he worked was barely staying afloat, and his boss, a tired old man named Walter, had warned him more than once that layoffs might be coming if business didn't pick up. Daniel's rent was due in 11 days, and he had exactly $340 in his bank account. Lily needed new shoes because her toes had begun pressing against the front of her sneakers, and her school had sent home a notice about an upcoming field trip that cost $45, an amount that felt like a mountain Daniel did not know how to climb. He had started skipping his own lunches to save money, telling Lily he simply wasn't hungry, a lie he repeated so often that his stomach had stopped protesting and his body had grown thin in a way that worried his co-workers. It was on an unusually warm Tuesday afternoon that Daniel's life intersected, almost by accident, with a world he had never imagined entering. Pete's Auto had received a call from the Ashworth estate, one of the wealthiest and most talked-about families in the entire state, requesting an emergency mechanic to come look at a vehicle that had stalled in their private garage during preparations for a charity gala. Walter, swamped with other appointments, had sent Daniel because he was the only one available, handing him the address with a warning to be polite, professional, and not to touch anything he wasn't asked to touch. When Daniel arrived at the Ashworth estate, he felt as though he had driven straight into a different universe. The mansion sat behind iron gates flanked by manicured hedges shaped into perfect spirals, with a driveway long enough to be its own small road, lined with statues that probably cost more than his entire apartment building. A member of the household staff led him through a side entrance into a private garage larger than his childhood home, filled with cars that looked like they belonged in a museum rather than a driveway. Daniel had never seen so much wealth concentrated in one place, and for a moment he felt the familiar sting of shame creeping up his neck, the kind of shame that whispered that he did not belong in rooms like this one. That was where he first saw Victoria Ashworth, though he did not yet know her name. She was standing near a sleek black sports car, dressed in a cream silk blouse and tailored trousers, speaking sharply into her phone about catering arrangements for an upcoming gala. She did not even glance at Daniel when he walked in, treating him the way the wealthy often treat the people who fix their problems, as though he were simply another piece of equipment summoned to perform a function and then disappear. Daniel quietly got to work on the stalled vehicle, a temperamental luxury sedan with an electrical fault, and within 40 minutes he had it running smoothly again, diagnosing a problem that, according to the household staff, 2 previous mechanics had failed to identify. It was only as he was packing up his tools that Victoria finally seemed to notice him, walking over with the kind of detached curiosity someone might show toward an unusual insect. She asked him almost mockingly whether he actually knew anything about real cars or just modern junk, and Daniel, too tired and too proud to filter himself, answered honestly that he had spent half his life restoring vintage automobiles, and that there was nothing in this garage he couldn't understand if given enough time. Something flickered across Victoria's face in that moment, something between surprise and the faintest trace of curiosity, though she quickly masked it with the same cold composure she wore like armor. What Daniel did not know was that Victoria Ashworth was a woman drowning in her own private grief, even as she stood inside a palace built from old family money. Her father, Richard Ashworth, the patriarch who had built much of the family's modern fortune, had passed away only 4 months earlier after a long illness, leaving behind a legacy so massive and complicated that Victoria had barely had time to mourn him before being thrust into boardrooms, legal battles, and family disputes over inheritance. Beneath her polished exterior, Victoria was exhausted, grieving, and increasingly cynical about a world where everyone around her seemed to want something from her father's name rather than caring about who he actually was. She had grown sharp-tongued and guarded as a form of self-protection, mistrustful of kindness, because she had learned that kindness, in her circles, often came with hidden price tags. Tucked away in the farthest corner of that same garage, hidden beneath a heavy canvas tarp that no one had touched in years, sat a rusted, decaying old car that the household staff referred to only as the old man's car, a vehicle so neglected that dust and cobwebs had become its second paint job. This car had belonged to Richard Ashworth, not as a status symbol, but as a private memory of his own humble beginnings. Long before the empire, the mansions, and the fortune, Richard Ashworth had been a poor immigrant mechanic's son who had restored this very car with his own hands during the early years of his life. Before fate, ambition, and a single brilliant business idea had transformed him into one of the wealthiest men in the country. He had kept the car not for its appearance, but because it represented the version of himself he never wanted to forget. The boy who once had nothing. What none of the family knew, not even Victoria, was that hidden within the frame of that car, sealed inside a custom-built compartment beneath the driver's seat that Richard had installed decades earlier with his own hands, sat a fortune in rare uncirculated coins, a handwritten letter, and documentation linking the vehicle to its true historical significance as one of only a handful of surviving prototypes from an early automotive manufacturer whose remaining models had become legendary among elite collectors, each one valued at staggering sums precisely because of how few examples still existed in drivable, original condition. The car wasn't simply old, it was priceless, and its true worth had been deliberately hidden by Richard Ashworth himself, who had left cryptic instructions in his will stating only that the old car should go to someone who sees worth where others see nothing, a phrase his family had dismissed as one of his usual sentimental riddles, never suspecting it held the key to millions. 2 weeks after Daniel's first visit to the estate, fate pulled him back into Victoria's orbit in a way neither of them expected. The Ashworth family was hosting what they called a legacy gala, an enormous charity event meant to honor Richard Ashworth's memory and raise funds for an educational foundation in his name. As part of a publicity stunt suggested by the family's event planner, Victoria had been encouraged to do something humanizing for the cameras, something that would soften her increasingly cold public image following her father's death. Someone on her team had jokingly suggested giving away one of the estate's old, unused vehicles to a deserving member of the public as a symbolic gesture of charity, and Victoria, exhausted and indifferent, had agreed without much thought, assuming it would be a forgettable photo opportunity. When the event planning team asked who should receive the gift, Victoria, in a moment of bitter amusement, mixed with the careless cruelty grief sometimes produces in people who feel like the world owes them nothing, remembered the blunt, plainly dressed mechanic who had fixed her car weeks earlier and spoken to her without an ounce of the fawning admiration she usually received from people. Some twisted part of her wanted to see his reaction, wanted to test whether a man who claimed to love old cars so much would still smile if handed something completely worthless. She instructed her assistant to invite Daniel Hayes to the gala, under the pretense of a special recognition for local working-class heroes, never imagining the invitation would change 2 lives forever. Daniel had almost declined the invitation when it arrived in his mailbox, certain it was some kind of mistake or scam, but Walter convinced him that any connection to a family as influential as the Ashworths might help bring new business to the struggling garage. Daniel borrowed a clean shirt from his neighbor, dropped Lily off with her elderly babysitter, and drove his rattling old pickup truck toward the Ashworth estate with a strange mixture of hope and dread sitting heavy in his chest. He told himself not to expect anything, that people like the Ashworths did not actually care about people like him, but some small, stubborn part of his heart still wondered if maybe, just maybe, something good was finally about to happen. The gala itself overwhelmed him from the moment he stepped inside. Crystal chandeliers hung from ceilings painted with intricate murals. Waitstaff moved silently through the crowd carrying trays of food Daniel couldn't even name, and the air smelled of expensive perfume and old money. He stood awkwardly near the edges of the ballroom, feeling every stitch of his second-hand clothing until an announcement called for everyone's attention and he was guided toward the center of the room, confused and increasingly anxious about what was happening. Victoria appeared at the top of a small staircase, dressed in white, looking every bit the elegant heiress the cameras adored, though Daniel could see something tired and hollow behind her eyes that the makeup couldn't quite hide. She gave a short, polished speech about honoring her father's legacy of generosity, about giving back to hard-working people who represented the values her father once held, and then gestured toward the cart being wheeled into the ballroom, draped in fabric that was dramatically pulled away to reveal the rusted, broken-down old car beneath it. A wave of muffled laughter rippled through the crowd of wealthy guests, many of whom understood instantly that this was meant as an ironic joke, a piece of theater designed to look generous on camera while actually being almost insulting in its uselessness. Victoria walked toward Daniel, holding the car's old tarnished keys between two fingers, her smile sharp and performative, and said in a voice loud enough for the cameras to catch perfectly that she hoped this small token would remind him that even old, broken things deserved a second chance, just like he apparently believed about cars nobody else wanted. The room erupted into polite, amused applause, the kind reserved for jokes everyone understands except the person standing at the center of them. Daniel felt his face burn with humiliation as he reached out and accepted the keys, forcing a smile because the cameras were watching and because some deeply ingrained part of him still believed that swallowing his pride was simply the price of survival. He thanked Victoria with as much grace as he could manage, though inside, something in him cracked quietly. Another small piece of dignity chipped away by people who would never understand what it felt like to have nothing and be mocked for wanting more. He drove the broken-down car home that night, towing it behind his pickup truck because it wouldn't even start, parking it in the cracked driveway outside his apartment building beneath a flickering street lamp, wondering if the universe was simply determined to remind him again and again exactly where he stood. For nearly 2 weeks, the car sat untouched in Daniel's driveway, a rusted monument to his own embarrassment. The neighborhood kids occasionally poking fun at the eyesore parked outside his building. Lily, however, was strangely fascinated by it, climbing into the driver's seat on weekend afternoons and pretending to drive to faraway places, telling her father stories about adventures they would go on once he fixed it up. It was Lily's persistent, innocent excitement, her small hands tracing the rusted dashboard with wide-eyed wonder, that eventually convinced Daniel to do what he did best: pull out his tools and start taking the old engine apart, not because he expected anything from it, but because fixing broken things was the only language that had ever made sense to him, the only place where his hands could create order out of chaos when the rest of his life felt completely unmanageable. It was during this process, while removing a corroded panel beneath the driver's seat to assess water damage, that Daniel discovered the hidden compartment Richard Ashworth had built decades earlier. Inside, wrapped carefully in oiled cloth that had somehow protected its contents from decades of decay, Daniel found a thick leather folder containing yellowed documents, a small velvet pouch filled with gleaming antique coins, and a handwritten letter addressed simply to whoever finally finds this. His hands trembled as he unfolded the letter beneath the dim light of his garage, reading words written by a man who had clearly understood long before his death that wealth without purpose was meaningless, and that the right person discovering this car would need exactly what was hidden inside it. The letter explained, in Richard Ashworth's own steady handwriting, the true history and authenticated value of the vehicle, listing documentation that proved its rarity among automotive historians and collectors, along with a heartfelt message about how the car represented his own journey from poverty to success, and his hope that whoever eventually possessed it would understand that genuine worth is rarely visible on the surface. Richard wrote that he had hidden these instructions deliberately, refusing to make the car's value public knowledge during his lifetime, because he wanted it to go to someone capable of seeing potential in something the world had already given up on, someone who understood in their bones what it meant to be underestimated. Daniel sat in stunned silence for nearly an hour, the letter trembling in his hands, his mind struggling to process what he was reading. He immediately searched online for verification of the documents, his heart pounding as he discovered articles, auction records, and collector forums confirming that vehicles matching this exact description, when authenticated and restored, had sold at private auctions for staggering sums, some reaching well into the millions of dollars due to their extraordinary rarity and direct connection to early automotive history. The rusted shell sitting in his driveway, the object that an entire ballroom of wealthy people had laughed at weeks earlier, was potentially worth more money than Daniel could have earned in 10 lifetimes working at Pete's Auto. For several agonizing days, Daniel wrestled with an impossible weight of decisions. Some desperate, exhausted part of him, the part that remembered skipping meals so Lily could eat, the part that remembered crying quietly in his truck after being unable to afford new shoes for his daughter, whispered that he could simply sell the coins quietly, restore the car privately, and never tell anyone about the letter, allowing himself to finally escape the suffocating weight of poverty that had defined his entire adult life. No one would ever know. The gift had been legally his, handed to him publicly with cameras rolling, and morally, after the public humiliation he had endured at that gala, some might even say he deserved whatever good fortune had landed in his lap. But Daniel kept returning to one single sentence from Richard Ashworth's letter, a sentence that echoed louder in his mind than any financial calculation. True worth is rarely visible on the surface, and what we choose to do when no one is watching reveals who we actually are. Daniel thought about his own daughter, about the values he desperately wanted to instill in her, despite everything life had stolen from them, about the kind of man he wanted Lily to one day describe when people asked about her father. He thought about integrity, a word that felt almost laughably old-fashioned in a world that constantly rewarded those willing to cut corners, and yet it was the one thing poverty had never managed to take from him. After 3 sleepless nights wrestling with his conscience, Daniel made a decision that would change everything. He carefully photographed every document, secured the coins and letter in a safety deposit box, and drove back to the Ashworth estate, requesting a private meeting with Victoria Ashworth, refusing to explain his reasons to the confused household staff who tried repeatedly to turn him away at the gate. Victoria, intrigued despite herself by the strange persistence of the mechanic she had publicly mocked weeks earlier, eventually agreed to see him, expecting perhaps a plea for money or some kind of awkward confrontation about the humiliating gift. What she received instead left her speechless. Daniel sat across from her in a small private study, his hand shaking slightly as he placed the leather folder, the velvet pouch of coins, and the handwritten letter on the table between them, explaining everything he had discovered, every detail of the car's hidden history, without omitting a single fact or asking for a single thing in return. He told her plainly that the car, the coins, and whatever monetary value attached to them rightfully belonged to her family, that he had simply been the unfortunate, unwitting recipient of what was clearly meant to remain within the Ashworth legacy, an inheritance from a father to his daughter, not a punchline meant for a stranger. Victoria stared at the documents on the table, then at Daniel, then back at the documents, her carefully maintained composure cracking for what felt like the first time in months. She recognized her father's handwriting instantly, and as she read his letter, tears she had been suppressing since his funeral finally broke free, falling silently down her cheeks as she absorbed words her father had written specifically, anticipating this exact moment, this exact test of character. She realized, with a wave of shame washing over her, that her own father had essentially designed a test of human integrity, using the very car she had handed away as a cruel joke, and that the supposedly poor, desperate mechanic she had mocked in front of an entire ballroom had just proven himself more honorable than nearly everyone in her own privileged social circle. For a long, heavy silence, Victoria simply looked at Daniel, seeing him, perhaps for the first time, not as a working-class stranger summoned to fix her problems, but as an actual human being possessing more genuine integrity than most people she had encountered throughout her entire wealthy, isolated life. She apologized quietly and sincerely for the gala, for the public humiliation she had orchestrated without truly considering his feelings, admitting that grief and exhaustion had hardened her into someone capable of cruelty she wasn't proud of. Daniel, surprising even himself, told her gently that he understood grief better than most people, having lost pieces of his own life to circumstances beyond his control, and that he held no anger toward her, only hope that perhaps this strange chain of events had happened for a reason neither of them yet fully understood. Victoria's father's will, it turned out, contained an additional clause that the family lawyers had never fully explained to her, one that Daniel's honesty had now activated. Richard Ashworth had written that if the car, along with its hidden contents, were ever returned voluntarily and honestly by whoever received it, that person would be entitled to a generous reward, equal to a meaningful percentage of the vehicle's authenticated value, a final test built into his estate to identify, reward, and celebrate genuine integrity in a world he had grown increasingly disillusioned with during his final years. When the family lawyers verified the documents and authenticated the vehicle's extraordinary worth at just over $9 million, they confirmed that Daniel was legally entitled to a reward substantial enough to completely transform his and Lily's lives forever. Daniel initially refused to accept it, insisting he had only done what any decent person should do. But Victoria, in a rare and deeply emotional moment witnessed only by her family's lawyer, insisted that honoring her father's final wishes meant more to her than any amount of money ever could. and that allowing Daniel to refuse this gift would dishonor the very lesson her father had been trying to teach through this elaborate posthumous test. She told him with genuine warmth, replacing the icy detachment he had first encountered weeks earlier, that her father had spent his final years searching for evidence that kindness, honesty, and humility still existed in a world increasingly obsessed with status and money, and that Daniel had unknowingly given a dying man's final wish its proper, beautiful ending. In the months that followed, Daniel's life transformed in ways he had never dared to imagine, even in his most desperate, exhausted moments. He paid off every debt that had haunted him since his divorce, moved himself and Lily into a modest but comfortable home with a real backyard where she could finally have the dog she had been asking for since she was 5 years old, and used a portion of his reward to open the small vintage restoration garage he had dreamed about since he was a teenager, learning engines beside his uncle, naming the shop quietly after his daughter. He hired 2 struggling young mechanics from his old neighborhood, men who reminded him painfully of himself a few years earlier, giving them the same kind of opportunity and dignity he had once desperately needed, but rarely received. Victoria Ashworth, profoundly changed by what she had witnessed, redirected significant portions of her family's charitable foundation toward genuinely supporting working-class families and small business owners, moving away from the performative, camera-friendly gestures that had once defined the foundation's public image. She and Daniel remained connected over the following months, an unlikely friendship slowly forming between 2 people from impossibly different worlds who had each, in their own way, been searching for proof that genuine goodness still existed somewhere beneath all the noise and performance of modern life. Their friendship, built on mutual respect rather than spectacle, eventually grew into something neither of them expected, something gentle and patient and real, the kind of connection that doesn't announce itself loudly, but simply settles quietly and permanently into a person's life. Lily, now attending a wonderful new school and finally sleeping soundly each night without worrying about whether her father had eaten dinner, often told people proudly that her dad had once been given a junky old car as a joke and turned it into the best thing that ever happened to their family, though she always added, with the simple wisdom only children seem to possess, that the real treasure wasn't the money at all, but the fact that her father had been brave enough to do the right thing even when nobody was watching, and everything inside him must have screamed to keep the secret for himself. If this story touched something deep inside you tonight, if it reminded you that honesty and kindness still matter in a world that often rewards the opposite, please take just a moment to like this video. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts and share it with someone in your life who needs a reminder that good things can still happen to good people. And before you go, we have one special request just for you watching right now. Comment the words "second chances" below if you believe, like Daniel did, that even the most broken, forgotten things in life deserve a real chance to be made whole again. Daniel Hayes never set out to become wealthy, never schemed or manipulated his way toward fortune, and perhaps that is precisely why fortune finally found him. Sometimes the universe tests us not through grand, obvious trials, but through small, quiet moments where no one is watching. Moments where the easiest choice and the right choice diverge sharply, and what we decide in those moments echoes far louder than we ever realize at the time. Somewhere out there tonight, perhaps Someone else is sitting beside their own version of that rusted old car, unaware of the hidden worth buried just beneath the surface, waiting only for someone brave enough, honest enough, and patient enough to uncover it. Thank you for watching this story all the way to the end, and we genuinely hope it left you feeling a little more hopeful about the world we all share. Don't forget to subscribe to Secret Storyline so you never miss another story like Daniel's. Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and remember, sometimes the smallest acts of integrity quietly become the biggest turning points of our entire lives.